Hi guys, the title of the title you see on the screen today. Don't forget to like and subscribe and we'll get started. This story begins in the Aston Empire, which was the strongest on the entire continent. And first, the founding of the empire, the O'Klein family maintained its prestige among all others. It was in this family that the legendary Alchemist showed his mastery of this branch of science, and that talent began to be passed on many generations later. The descendants, in turn, honed their alchemy skills all for the sake of the family business, which allowed the family to maintain a high reputation in the community. And currently, the O'Kleins own the largest alchemical workshop in the entire empire. And a man by the name of James O'Klein, who was the head of the household, used to drop in there quite often to see if things were all right. And one day, he looked in there again. The alchemists, who were still too young and afraid of him all the time, greeted him nervously. They were working on some new potion, so they were quite busy. The man, for his part, walked by and said he was here to see Rebecca, so they'd better ignore him and get on with their work. In fact, there were quite a few alchemists who looked up to James. He used this science to create various weapons and helped the empire increase its military power several times over. That is why he was popularly known as the father of all arms, and to this man his daughter was the most precious thing he ever had. The man walked across the workshop to the furnaces, where it was usually a little difficult to work because of the intense temperatures. But that's where he saw his daughter, working hard. He coughed to get her to pay attention to him, but he thought he was paying too much attention to her. But at that moment, Rebecca suddenly heard some strange noises, and when she turned to check, she was very surprised to see her father. The girl was dressed in a special uniform to avoid getting dirty and burned, and she also had special glasses on her eyes to avoid getting hurt. As soon as she saw James, she immediately ran into his arms, asking him what had brought him and how he was doing in general. The man was immediately happy to see his daughter, for he really loves her very much, and said he was feeling much better. But then, suddenly he became more serious and told Rebecca that they needed to have a serious talk. She immediately began to listen to him attentively, and the man thought that he should be at least a little more strict with her in order to keep her from being knocked out of his hands. The girl, in turn smiling, said that she was going to visit him in the evening anyway, and it was very good that he had come, for she had really got something worthy of his attention this time. James put his hand on her shoulder, and Rebecca said that from the beginning she had decided to invent a potion that would take away scars. But something had gone wrong for her. Her father would not listen to her to the end and moved closer, became very serious and asked her to stop. Rebecca was a little wary. She was very surprised at the voice her father had and the stern look he had. But James in turn said he's talking about her alchemy classes. He wants her to stop doing it. When Rebecca heard this, she was very surprised and asked what it meant and, more importantly, why. The man sighed heavily and said that she was already 24 years old after all, and time was flying very fast. The girl interrupted him then and asked if it was all about Judith. If it was because she had seen Rebecca secretly reading the book at the last ball. She asked him if it was Judith. She said that there was a small space behind the curtain, and she thought that no one would notice her. Then she apologized to her father and said she would be more careful next time. James smiled and said that wasn't the point at all. He had heard that if she didn't get married this year, she would be in big trouble. He had, after all, been letting her do whatever she wanted all this time, and it was time to put it all aside and prepare for her future wedding. Rebecca, when she heard those words, was just horrified, and she told her father that she just didn't want to get married. She didn't need it at all. The man stepped back and wondered what she was going to do then. The girl was even more angered by the question, and she said that of course she wanted to continue working as an alchemist in the workshop as she always had. Then James asked if she really thought William would allow it. He told him something, because once he was gone, this guy wouldn't take care of the girl. And Rebecca is also well aware that he doesn't have many personal assets to support her. He'll be able to pass them on to her, but it still won't be enough to live on his own without worrying. Rebecca tearfully said that even if she had to live in poverty, she still wanted to do what she loved, not get married and be cut off from it all. She is happy now. Working every day as an alchemist is an incredible privilege for her. But then suddenly her father shouted and asked her to stop. He said he had made a promise to her mother, a promise that she would never practice alchemy again. Rebecca could barely contain her emotions from crying at all, and asked her father why he was against all this. She was doing so well, but the man, raising his voice, asked if she really thought she was capable of making a living from some kind of alchemy. She needed to think about all the things she'd done up to that point. None of her inventions are worth anything, so she needs to end this business and start thinking about marriage, because it's all for her own good. After all that had happened, Rebecca went to the temple. She sat in front of the huge statue of the dragon her people worshipped. The girl was desperate. She said she didn't want to get married and certainly didn't want to give up alchemy because it was the best thing in her life. Rebecca just wants to go on with her life as it is, and she wasn't sure if her desire was like some childish dreams that aren't worth a dime. She lowered her head down and said in a quiet voice that her father had never scolded her until now. But apparently he had thought she was just a talentless alchemist all this time. Then she turned to this dragon, whose name was Artel, and said that she knew the whole truth after all. Rebecca is really just a superior alchemist that no one can compare to, and this situation has awakened mixed feelings in her. But she's going to be stronger and above it all. After all, now is not the time to create the very illegal substance that will help her. She turned to the dragon again and asked if it was true that the times mentioned by the legendary O'Klein were not yet upon us. And that's why Rebecca will continue to carry on the legacy of their family and city, will carry the title of Best Alchemist. But she didn't know how she was going to do all this now, and apparently she would even have to run away from home in order to make it a reality. The girl was so engrossed in praying to Artel that she didn't even notice the man appearing behind her. And so, when she had finished crying and talking to the greatest dragon, she turned to leave, when suddenly she noticed a handkerchief on the floor. The girl immediately picked it up and was very surprised. Rebecca assumed that the great Artel had given it to her. She knew it could hardly be true, however, but she still felt good at the thought. She pressed the handkerchief to her cheeks, wiping away her tears. Rebecca noticed that it smelled quite nice, and it was also made of a very soft fabric. But it was a mystery to the girl who might have left it behind. In fact, it had been accidentally dropped by the man who had overheard her conversation with the great Artel. In fact, a few hours before Carlyle's visit to the temple, he had been at a ball. All the girls, as soon as he entered the hall, immediately began to turn around and stare at him, because he was really handsome. Many people immediately began to whisper and talked about how it was the same Duke of Rowenster. Carlyle was the Duke himself. He was of the Athena family, like the first swordsman to appear in the Empire. Not to mention his striking and beautifully divine looks, women were far more enamored with his virile and pumped-up body. Some of the ladies, when they saw him at the ball, kept sighing, and one of them said she felt as if she had never seen a man so tall. Another, sighing, said she liked his broad shoulders best, and his beautiful dark form that perfectly accentuated his purple hair. They were sure that the great dragon goddess Artel had bestowed all the love she could upon him. The man who wanted to pass by all these ladies realized that his passage was blocked, for they began to encircle him from all sides. Carlyle really didn't like that, and frowned and started looking at them all, not realizing where it would be possible to pass. The girls, however, when they saw it, immediately began to admire it, for even his frown, in their opinion, was simply adorable. But at this moment their admiration was interrupted by the voice of a woman who came up to them, and turning to the ladies, asked what they were all doing. This woman was Haley Carsius, who was the daughter of Duke Carsius. When the ladies saw her, they immediately turned in that direction and were a little wary, for they realized that it was too impolite of them to do so. Haley, for her part, said that His Majesty the Emperor wanted to see his grace, so she didn't think it was a good idea to just delay him, so they'd better part ways. When the girls heard this, they immediately began to whisper. They resented this behavior, not understanding why she was saying such things, and thought she was his wife. In fact, they also thought that if this girl wasn't Duke Carsius's daughter, they would have answered her. But because all these ladies were very engrossed in conversation and discussion, Carlyle had a chance to go quietly through them all. They were very nervous that they had missed their happiness to stand by his side a little longer. But the man just started to walk away, not paying any attention to all these girls. Haley, for her part, continued to stand among them all and just watched. The man looked back before he left, and she smiled back at him, After a while, Carlyle finally reached His Majesty the Emperor and immediately bowed, greeting him. However, the Emperor, who was sitting at his desk, smiled and said that he didn't want to see all these formalities, because in his opinion, they were only taking up time. So he decided to get right to the point, so as not to beat around the bush, and asked Carlyle when he was going to get married. The man stiffened with surprise when he heard this question. He remained silent for a while, not knowing what to say. But then he bowed again and said that he had no such plans yet, so he unfortunately could not give an answer. The Emperor, in turn, got angry and asked how he could settle down like this when he wasn't going to settle down and finally find a worthy consort. At this moment, because he was very sick, the Emperor started coughing and couldn't stop for a while. When the Emperor did calm down, Carlyle apologized for such words, but according to his doctor, the only problem was that he was too healthy for his age, so he was definitely not in danger of an early death. The Emperor was indignant and told him to shut up, because when you become a very old person, you never know what might happen to you the next day. You might just go to sleep and not even wake up, so this is a great danger. The Emperor sighed heavily and said that his father had been a fairly close friend to him, and even the husband of his dear little sister. He was so young, but he still gave his life to save him on the battlefield, and it just makes his heart burst. Then the Emperor began to shout, saying that he was just a heartless and ungrateful boy who wouldn't listen to him again. Carlyle was completely calm. He said it was all because he was a swordsman, so he didn't need to get married. The Emperor, still very angry, said that he might have surpassed human capabilities, but he was still human. He also added that his father had taken his hand the moment he was worried about leaving him at such an early age. He had just begged him to have the Emperor attend his wedding instead of his father. Carlyle felt uncomfortable with this conversation and apologized, saying that he had no such thoughts even on his mind, so he couldn't promise anything. Then the Emperor replied that he knew very well how difficult it was for him in general, for he was the center of female attention in the whole empire, and he knew how tiring it could be. Yet still, no matter how patient he tries to be, there is simply no end to it. Carlyle doesn't even think about it or pick up any options. The lad turned to His Majesty and asked that he would give him a little more time, and he would be sure to provide him with the one he wanted to marry. They were silent for a while. Then the Emperor said he just had no shame, and asked if the guy even knew how many times he'd heard it from him before. Therefore, as the ruler of this empire, he orders Carlyle to marry within this year, or else he will be severely punished. When the guy heard this, he was very indignant. He already wanted to argue with His Majesty, but it was useless to do so. The Emperor said that if he didn't, he would personally arrange his marriage of convenience, and he should keep that in mind, for he would pick up as many favorable options as possible. Carlyle then went outside to get some fresh air and clear his head after this heavy conversation. Then suddenly a guy in a uniform came up to him. It was Aubert, the current emperor, and he said that Carlyle looked pretty sad. The latter in turn bowed to greet His Highness, but Aubert suggested that these formalities be omitted. Carlyle had to agree. Then he wondered what his father had told him, for he was really curious. He was silent for some time, and then, with a heavy sigh, he said that he wanted him to get married a year in advance, or else a marriage of convenience awaited him. Aubert stepped closer to him and said that it was rather cruel. It was to be expected of a father, however. If he goes that far, he thinks his aunt has already conceded to him. Saying those words, the guy kept smiling the whole time. Then Carla asked if he was really that impressed. Hearing no reply from his friend, he said that he understood perfectly well that he had to marry eventually. For you can't just let the Rowan-Store bloodline fall into the abyss. And besides, his younger sister has her own problems there too. Aubert, for his part, said that he really needed to settle down now, because he was already 28 years old. Carlyle sighed heavily, and said that it must be true. The friend added that if it were him, he would go to Lady Haley, because she was the most beautiful of all the options. But the boy, turning away, said he didn't care at all about her looks. Aubert laughed and said that he doubted that this girl would give him the opportunity to marry any other girl, and that's because she's already acting like she's his fiancée. But Karlovich said that it didn't matter, because he was definitely not going to marry her. But the junior emperor smiled nervously and said that it would only make things worse for him if he turned the entire house of Carcius against him. Carlyle turned around and said he didn't care at all and would be on his way out now. Auburn, remaining where he was, inquired if he was going to that temple again. The boy replied that of course he was going there. He explained that it was the most convenient and peaceful place of all the ones in their empire, so immediately he went there. As he entered, he said hello to the men who were guarding. As soon as he got inside, he saw a girl praying to a large dragon, and at that moment he was immediately reminded of a memory from 10 years ago of this very girl. When he was still very young, girls were chasing him like crazy. They were always looking for him at the most inopportune moments and trying to talk to him, even if it was for nothing. The boy hid from them behind a tree, not understanding why they were always chasing him, and decided to get out of there as soon as possible. While the girls continued to look for him, Carla ran as fast as possible and returned to his manor, closing the doors. He saw that the pantry was open, so he decided to hide in that place and waited out for a while until those girls left. But as soon as he went inside, he immediately saw a girl sitting in the very corner, reading a book. She was so engrossed in the story that she didn't even notice him. But the moment he saw her face, his heart began to beat even faster, and his breathing froze. He stepped closer to her, and then Rebecca did turn around, and when she saw the stranger in front of her, she screamed loudly in surprise. But then she stood up quickly and walked closer to him, asking him who he was. She was still scared, but she tried to stay strong. The girl also inquired if he had come looking for her by any chance. Carlyle immediately raised his hands and waved his head and said nothing. He still couldn't speak out of fear. Rebecca eyed him suspiciously for a while longer. Then she smiled and said that in that case, it was a good thing. The man blushed even more and realized that he was a little scared. He also realized that he was not the only one who had come to this place to hide from everyone. The girl, in turn, went back to reading the book by the window. She was very focused. He was already thinking that he should leave, because she might pounce on him like the rest of them. Rebecca, however, was writing something down and trying to figure out some formula. Carlyle was very surprised that this girl takes and reads a book at a party, hiding from everyone. After all, even his little sister was incredibly happy to come to this place, that she had spent hours primping her skin and hair, tidying up, and she was hiding here, and also reading some book. Carlyle stepped closer and looked inside and saw various formulas. Then he guessed it was probably alchemy. Rebecca was still focused and sighing heavily asked why there was no way she could figure it out. Then the guy behind her started coughing to get her to pay attention to him. But she didn't care. He raised his voice, but that didn't work either. So he decided to walk over to her, tapping on her shoulder to get the girl to pay attention to him. He sat down next to her, pointing somewhere off to the side, saying that she must have that part wrong, so it didn't add up. Rebecca immediately reviewed her notes and jumped up and said that it was indeed true. Then she smiled and thanked him for his help, saying that now she really had everything worked out and came together. Carl was incredibly pleased that he was able to be of use to her after all. Then he decided to step back, in order to not interfere anymore, and standing back, just watched her start to figure things out again. In fact, this was the first time he had ever seen such a thing, for this girl seemed completely uninterested and didn't even look at him like all the previous ones. Carlyle also wondered if she even knew who he was. Then the boy began to scrutinize her appearance to see who she was. He noticed her red hair and also realized that she was an alchemist, and assumed that she was most likely from the Oaklane family. He also suggested that most likely this girl, like himself, really dislikes social events, so she came to a secluded place so no one would touch her. The guy smiled when he saw how intensely focused she was, and even thought she was a pretty nice girl. Even though it was the first time he had ever done so, he still didn't dislike him. So when he came to the temple that day, he quickly hid himself so that Rebecca wouldn't notice him. As the man stood listening to her pray, he realized that she hadn't changed at all. It had been almost 10 years, and she was still the same. Then he saw that she had even begun to cry, and he frowned. The boy moved as quietly as he could, and left his blue handkerchief beside the girl, so that she would have something to wipe her tears with. After that, he silently headed back, and Rebecca, no matter how hard she tried, still couldn't see him. But in truth, Carlyle was incredibly pleased that he had given her the thing after all. Soon afterward, he left the temple and returned to the manor, for some rest after a hard day's work. However, as soon as he passed the garden, he was greeted by a girl. It was Adelgate Roamingster, Carlyle's mother and the former emperor's younger sister. The woman, upon seeing him, immediately smiled and said that he had finally returned. The boy immediately bowed to greet his mother. She came closer and said that he looked better than she expected. She thought that his brother would immediately issue an imperial decree regarding him. Carlyle, smiling, said that technically he had done it in principle. Then Mother asked in surprise what was wrong with his face, why he was so pleased. But the guy in turn asked what she thought he should look like. The woman still didn't understand what was going on, because he didn't look like himself. Well, then he went up to Mother and asked her what she thought of the O'Klein family in general. The woman was wary, and then said that they, like their family, had quite a history. They'd been with her since the beginning of Estain's appearance, and the very first of their family was a legendary alchemist. Not to mention the head of House Himes had done many things for their empire. Carlyle stood there and smiled as he heard all this. He was really pleased that this girl's family was quite successful and helped the whole empire. The woman suddenly thought about it and said that Hames had a daughter, by the way, and looked at her son and couldn't believe that he really wanted to do what she thought he did. But Carlyle, smiling, said it was really true. It's Rebecca O'Klein, and he wants to send her a wedding proposal. After a while, Rebecca came home and knocked on William's room, whom she had been called before. The guy, hearing this, immediately said that she could go in. But the girl, as soon as she entered the room, she was immediately wary, because the atmosphere was quite tense and even strange. Rebecca also looked around the room. She noticed that not only William was there, but also his wife Judith. Dress and Locke were also present, so she was very wary. William in turn turned to the girl, and holding out an envelope to her, said that a marriage proposal had come in her name. She took the envelope and looked at him in surprise, not understanding why he had that look on his face, because he wanted to get rid of her that way. And now he wasn't happy about it. Before opening this letter, Rebecca mentally turned to the great hotel and couldn't believe that she really had no choice but to quit alchemy and get married. For the moment, when she opened and finally began to read the contents of the letter, it was very surprising, for it was from the Duke of Rowanster. Soon after, it was decided that she needed to visit their estate to discuss things, and the next day, Rebecca was packed and came in a carriage to the Duke's estate. As soon as the girl got out and saw this huge castle, she was very surprised. She looked around and realized that the Duke's estate was on a whole other level, and that impressed her. At that moment, the butler came to her and said that his lordship was already waiting for her in the drawing room. He also said that he would escort her. Rebecca thanked him, and they went inside. The girl couldn't stop shaking with fear. The whole situation was getting on her nerves. But as they walked farther and farther away, she also noticed that everything inside was much more chic, even than the outside. Rebecca was also uncomfortable because she had never worn a dress like this before, and it was very constricting. But soon they finally arrived at their desired destination. Two butlers immediately opened the doors for her so that she could enter spectacularly. And as soon as Rebecca took a step across the threshold, she was immediately greeted and also introduced herself. Rebecca immediately started to approach him, but was so nervous and in a hurry that she almost even fell over. She greeted the Duke and also said her name. Carlyle walked over to the table that was near the window and motioned for her to sit down, for he had prepared tea for them, and said that he hoped she would like the drink. Once the girl was in her seat, she could exhale with relief. He pretended he hadn't seen it, and that was nice of him, but she needed to pull herself together and not have any more awkward situations like this. So she told him right away that she really liked tea. He poured her a cup for her to try, and as soon as Rebecca began to drink it, the man noticed that she was shaking with fear and excitement. Carlyle smiled, thinking that was rather nice. After a few moments of silence, he said that the girl must have been surprised at this sudden proposal of marriage. When the girl heard this, she choked on her tea in surprise. She quickly put the cup on the table, so that nothing more would happen, and said that it was absolutely true. She was very surprised. Then she looked away due to awkwardness and said that she was definitely not someone worthy of a man of his level. And at that moment, she tried to tell herself to stop her nerves and stop worrying. But then suddenly Carlyle laughed very loudly and sincerely. Rebecca looked at him in surprise, and he in turn apologized, realizing how rude it was of him. The man knew he couldn't just pick up and tell her that she had completely ignored him reading the book in the past, and it hadn't embarrassed her in any way. And now she was saying something about status. The girl put her head down and said that she didn't think she was worthy to accept such a large and meaningful offer from him. Carlyle was silent for a while, and then he said that, to be honest, he had no plans to marry her. Rebecca looked at him in surprise when she heard this, and he in turn calmly began to drink his tea. Then the girl, still unrestrained by emotion, jumped up and asked why he had sent that awful invitation if he wasn't going to marry her. Then she wanted to say something else, but at that moment she remembered Judith's words about it being a chance in a million for her to be chosen by a person of such importance as the Duke. She was bound to accept the offer, no matter what. William agreed with her and said that she simply could not refuse it. If she did, she would no longer be a part of their family. It was incredibly hard for Rebecca to relive all of this, because the way they were pushing her was very difficult. Suddenly the girl realized that she was just standing there shouting at the Duke. She sat up and wanted to explain in a shaky voice, but he interrupted her, saying it was all right and she could say anything she wanted. Carlyle, smiling, replied that the reason he had sent that invitation for her was because he knew her and was in the same boat. She looked at him in surprise and asked what he even meant, for she really didn't understand what he was saying all this for. The man in turn asked if she wasn't being pressured by the whole family to get engaged and get married as soon as possible. Rebecca, when she heard this explanation, was very surprised, for he said the same thing was happening to him. Carlyle explained that he is in a very difficult position at the moment, as he doesn't want to commit to marriage anytime soon. But what's even worse is that the person he's up against is precisely the past emperor. Rebecca sighed heavily and said that it was already hard for her to go against her family, and it was probably much harder for him to go against the emperor himself. Carlyle waved her head with a smile, and he was very pleased, for he knew she would understand and not judge him. Then he said that it was all about the fact that when he received His Majesty's orders to get married, he was rather upset. That was why he visited the Temple of Artel. The girl, when she heard this, immediately guessed that he had probably been there at the same time she had. Then Rebecca panicked and asked if he had really heard everything she said. The man, pouring himself some more tea, said that it was quite right. That was how he understood her situation. The girl was silent for a while and then, blushing all over, asked if it came out that it was he who had left her the handkerchief. Carlyle coughed and said that was correct. It was easy for him to conceal his presence since he is a swordsman. However, he didn't want to eavesdrop at all, because that would be very impolite. So he thought that their meeting was part of Artel's own plan. When Rebecca heard this, she was very surprised. For a while she just stared at the man, who inquired how she looked at contracting an engagement to him. The girl, hearing this, was a little doubtful, and even asked if he really wanted a contract engagement. The man became very serious and said that everything was absolutely right. That was exactly what he proposed. Then Rebecca thought about the proposal and realized that he wanted them to pretend to be engaged in public. Seeing her worried face, Carlyle said that usually an engagement lasts from 3 months to 2 years, and in this case he wanted their relationship to last 2 years. The girl, hearing this, asked if she correctly understood that he wanted to avoid the pressure by having a not real engagement so that everyone would believe it and stop worrying so much. Carlyle replied that it was exactly like that, but Rebecca was indignant and said that she didn't think it was such a good idea, because after 2 years, the engagement would be broken off, and then people and relatives will start pushing them again, and it's like gradually postponing the inevitable. There will be no result from it. The man, thinking about it, said that she was right after all. But a lot can change in 2 years. Rebecca looked at him in surprise and said in a shaky voice that she wasn't sure she fully understood him. Carlyle said that he had, after all, spoken of having received orders from His Majesty. However, after 2 years, he would not be able to order him to do anything, which included a forced marriage of convenience. The girl, hearing all this, was very surprised and asked if he was really talking about the hatching tradition now. But the man replied that everything was absolutely correct. Then she could say nothing more, for it shocked her. In fact, the tradition of hatching exists only in the imperial family of Astane. The first ruler of the empire was the son of the great dragon Artel. Artel remained in the imperial capital when her son ascended the throne to look after him and all his children. To this day, she remains a loyal guardian of the empire, and so to honor her motherly love, the imperial family created the so-called hatching tradition. This tradition enabled the former emperor to refuse aid to the new emperor. According to this tradition, the former emperor continues to have some imperial power, so one should never refuse his orders. But in 2 years, it will no longer make any sense at all. He would give up his power completely and leisurely spend the rest of his life in the past emperor's palace in the south. Rebecca asked in surprise, wondering if the current emperor would then press her. But Carlyle, laughing, said he certainly wouldn't do that. He thought about the fact that he didn't think the boy would risk a relationship with a swordsman over some pathetic wedding. He also said that if they did go back to the contract, he was asking her to stay in the place under the pretext that she needed training before marriage. Rebecca was indignant and asked why he suddenly wanted her to stay on his estate. It didn't suit her at all, but the man explained that his family would also be informed of their agreement. Therefore, there is absolutely nothing to worry about. And even on the record, she would be receiving wedding lessons from his mother. And in reality, she would be allowed to do whatever she wanted as long as she was on the estate. Carlyle smiled and said that he would even promise her to turn one of the outbuildings into her personal alchemy workshop. When Rebecca heard this, she was frozen in place. She couldn't believe that he would actually give her the private workshop she had long dreamed of. She was already beginning to imagine how she would work in this workshop, how she would have plenty of space and time to develop her inventions, and it was quite a tempting proposition for a girl. But then suddenly Carlyle said that even though he mentioned it earlier, but the moment their contract is up, everything will be quietly canceled. Even so, he would continue to sponsor her for the rest of her life. Rebecca was surprised and asked him what he meant by that. The man explained that at the end of the contract he would prepare a residence for her, also providing her with all the essentials for her research in alchemy. The girl will be able to choose where to stay. She can stay in the capital city, or she can go to wherever she wants to go. He will also make sure she has all the finances she needs, and it's all for good. When Rebecca heard about it, she couldn't believe her happiness, and that it would last as long as she lived. Carlyle, thinking about it, said that if she wanted, he could even invest in a huge workshop for her. But the girl immediately stopped him and told him he should know. She wouldn't be able to create anything of value by weapon type like her father. But the man laughed and replied that it was nothing. His family had plenty of money and he had quite enough personal savings. So she didn't have to worry about that at all and could do what she liked. She was silent for a while, and then said with a blazing look that he must really hate the whole wedding thing, since he was willing to go to such lengths. Carlyle stared into her eyes for a while. Then, looking away, he said that everything he had said earlier would be included in the special contract, and he promised that nothing would be changed or taken away. He's going to act with integrity. But the girl wasn't going to say no. She said she believed him even so. But then suddenly she put her head down and said that even though she was overly grateful for his offer, she wondered if he could give her some time to think things over and make a final decision. The man was a little surprised at this, but said that of course she could do it. And once she had made her decision, he asked that she visit him again to notify him. He also said that his marriage proposal buys them some time anyway, so she can take it easy. Rebecca was still impressed by everything she had heard and thanked him for everything. When it began to get dark outside, the girl finally returned to the manor where her family was waiting for her. As soon as she crossed the threshold of the house, her father came running to her. He inquired how it had gone with her, and William's wife asked what she had talked about with the Duke, and at once whether they would be betrothed. Rebecca couldn't talk about anything right now. She ran upstairs and said she would explain everything the next day. Judith shouted after her, telling her that they needed an answer now. They couldn't wait until tomorrow. But Rebecca didn't care about any of that. She quickly ran upstairs and closed the door to the room behind her. But soon her father knocked on her door. She let him come in. His eyes were sad. Hames stepped closer to her and, putting his hand on her shoulder, said he understood exactly how she felt now, for Locke was also the most worried about her. Wow, he said in a caring voice that this must all be really, really pressuring for her, considering she ran straight to her room instead of to her workshop. Rebecca was silent for a while. Then she turned to her father and wanted to explain the whole situation. But he interrupted her. The man, smiling, said that this guy was a pretty good person. The girl agreed and said that he was too good even for her. Hames also added that the status of a duchess would have quite a few responsibilities. However, she will also have many privileges, and among the rest of the empire, it is indeed the best option for someone like her. He also said that the roadies have always been very nice to them, and it's very nice of them to notice her after all. Rebecca thought at that moment that she wasn't really getting married. It was just a contract and nothing more. It's a contract to deceive her family and the Asterin family. So her father has too many expectations about it. They were silent for a while. Then he put his arm around his daughter and told her that last night he had seen her mother in his dream. She asked him if her dear daughter was happy. Well, then he woke up because of that he couldn't give her an answer. When Rebecca heard the story about her mother, she was ready to cry. She missed her incredibly much. Hames sighed heavily and said that her mother, Cordelia, had gone through many hardships, for she was a noblewoman who had no title. And when she appeared in his dream again, he would be proud to tell her that their little girl would soon be a duchess and would not know the hardships that she herself did. The man smiled at Rebecca and said he was quite sure Mother would be pleased to hear and learn the news. Then he turned around and started to leave, smiling before leaving. He said he wouldn't bother her, because she was probably very tired, so she should rest. As the door slammed shut, the man left her alone with her thoughts. Rebecca was in a panic and didn't know what to do. The girl changed her clothes rather quickly and went to her workshop, thinking that alchemy would help her relax and remove unnecessary thoughts. As soon as the girl stepped inside, she was immediately greeted by her co-workers. They said hello to Rebecca and looked worried. Looking surprised at how scared they were, Rebecca asked, "Is something wrong?" One of the men hesitated, but after that decided to just show her. He stepped aside and the girl was just furious. She ran to where her desk was supposed to be. Rebecca didn't realize where she belonged, so she asked, "What happened to all those things that were in there?" The men did not know what to say to her. Then one of them said that her brother William O'Clane had ordered her things out of the workshop yesterday. He also told them that she would no longer need them as she was getting married, so they obeyed his order. Rebecca was just furious and desperate. She had lost all her notes, realizing that William couldn't just take it to a storage unit somewhere. He threw it all away. There was no way to recover it now. Without thinking long, she went straight to his office. The man, for his part, was sitting at his desk. In fact, his head was still full of the same case. He could never have believed that Rebecca would marry a duke. But there was an upside to it. At this point, he was distracted from dealing with various matters. There was a knock at the door, and he said at once that she could come in. It was Rebecca. She opened the door angrily and immediately turned to William. The girl stepped closer, asking why he had gotten rid of all her things in the workshop. And she also wondered what he'd even done with her notes, creations, and all the research she'd done over the years. She walked over to his desk and slammed her hands against it and asked where he threw it all away. William was very surprised at this behavior of Rebecca's and started yelling at her, asking what she was even thinking about herself. But the girl was no longer afraid. Her anger was getting the better of her, and she said she would like to ask him just such a question. William said, in case she didn't know, he actually had a limit to his patience with her arrogance, and he was running out of it now. Then he pointed his finger in her direction and said that he was the head of the Oakland family for the moment, and she should show at least a little respect towards him. But Rebecca was incredibly angry. She wondered if he could answer her one question about why he'd cleaned out her desk. The maids who were standing outside the door immediately began to whisper, discussing the whole situation. William was incredibly angry. When he saw them talking, he couldn't believe that Rebecca dared to humiliate him in front of the servants. So he started yelling at her even harder, asking her how her father had raised her in the first place, and also asking her what her problem was. Why can't she understand basic things? She's getting married very soon. That's why it's time for her to leave all those childhood dreams behind and accept the harsh reality. Rebecca was ready to cry and wondered if he really thought her fondness for alchemy were childish dreams. He in turn started yelling even louder and said, "Of course it is." After all, everything she had done before was just useless garbage that no one would even ever use. The only reason she had so much space in her workshop was because her father let her do it. Rebecca started to defend herself and said it was completely irrelevant. She took the test just like everyone else. William chuckled then, and wondered what she had even done then. She had never created anything of real value. And who would even call her an alchemist under those circumstances? Rebecca was so surprised at such a statement from William, and asked in a quiet voice what he had even done. He only took this place because he is his father's son. But the man, angry, told her not to even think of associating him with the likes of herself. And even if that's really true, at least he can see what actually matters, while all Rebecca does is useless experiments that won't do any good for society, and can only do harm. The girl wondered what he wanted from her in the first place. Did he want her to invent some philosopher's stone that would make one immortal? Or something that only the legendary O'Klein could create? The boy turned away from her and said that actually he is not going to believe in these dreams that were left behind by their ancestors. He's going for real success, just like his father. The girl asked if he was really building weapons, and wondered how he was doing, if he even had any ideas, since he'd failed at a lot of projects he'd done before. William looked at her irritably and asked how she even knew, but the girl started yelling, saying that he had spent their entire family fortune on a failed project, and now he's trying to criticize her abilities as an alchemist. Then she turned around and started to walk away. The man became indignant and started calling her names. However, she interrupted him. Rebecca replied that she understood. He made her realize that she didn't have to think about it anymore. When William heard that, he was very surprised and asked what she meant. She in turn said she was going to marry the Duke of Roamingster, and now she was sure it was the right decision after all. When she said those words, William didn't say anything back. Then the girl simply walked out, slamming the door behind her. Williams in turn wondered if she was going to abandon their family after the wedding, and he really hoped she wouldn't. He began to reassure himself, saying that everything would be fine, and also that once she got married, the girl would no longer be able to live as an alchemist no matter how hard she tried. Because of Rebecca being a duchess, she would have to honor her status. At this time, Rebecca had already managed to run into her father's study, who was just picking up a book to read in the evening. When the man saw her, he was very surprised, for she was very anxious and upset. He immediately asked her what was wrong. Rebecca ran up to him and hugged him and called William an idiot, but Hames hugged her back and told her not to do that, because he was her older brother. However, the girl didn't care at all. Now she said it didn't matter at all because he had gotten rid of her expensive workshop table. She also said that he had just brazenly thrown away all her notes and everything she had done over the years. When the man heard this, he sincerely began to sympathize with his daughter. But then in a quiet voice he added that she'd have to give it up eventually anyway. So at the moment she just had no need to get so upset like this. Rebecca, when she heard this, couldn't believe her father was really saying it. He in turn said she says, getting married very soon, so there's no point in all these records and her creation right now. Seeing his daughter's surprised face, he coughed and said that of course not. He did not think William's actions were right, for he had thrown away her things without permission. Rebecca was indignant and said that wasn't the point at all, but he interrupted her again, saying that now that it had happened, even this situation could be taken advantage of, and good things could be found. Hayes also said she can now focus on wedding lessons and the engagement session in order to make everything perfect. The girl said she doesn't want to do that at all. She wants to go into alchemy. However, the father started coughing, pretending that he couldn't hear her. Rebecca was silent for a while, then said that if she wasn't his daughter, and if she wasn't part of the Oakland family, she probably wouldn't even be accepted into this workshop. The man smiled and told his daughter that he understood perfectly well that she didn't like all this, but he really asked that the girl not get angry, because it didn't matter to him whether she was an alchemist or not. She will forever be his dearest and most beloved daughter, no matter what she does, no matter what her hobbies are, and no matter who is around her. Then Rebecca suddenly turned her attention to her father, who had started coughing again and with his illness, and wondered if he had ever even acknowledged her as a real alchemist. William and his wife Locke and her father, none of them had ever looked at her as a true alchemist. None of them had ever supported her or understood her. Sighing heavily, the girl realized that she was going to contract the engagement anyway, so she swore to herself that she was going to make everyone else see what a pro she was in the industry. And in order to do so, she must of course first make a contract with the Duke, who has very fine living conditions. Sometime later, a butler came in to see Carlyle, who was sitting in his study, sorting out his papers. He bowed and said that Lady Rebecca wished to see him. The man was a little surprised, for she finally accepted the answer. It was rather quick, however, for he had expected it to take a little longer. Soon, however, he went to meet her and finally learned the answer. As he passed the maids, they began to whisper again. One of them suggested that perhaps his lordship really intended to marry, for he hated women. And now everything had changed. Soon Carlyle came to the special room, where guests are welcomed, and saw that the girl was already sitting at a small table waiting for him. As soon as he entered the room, Rebecca immediately turned in his direction and saw the smile on his face. She wasn't very happy herself. The man walked closer to her, bowed and wished her good morning, then took a seat across from her. She spoke first and apologized for coming so quickly and so early, but Carlyle replied that it was all right. But he also wondered what had happened to her, for the girl looked worried and even sad. Rebecca pretended that nothing had happened and laughed nervously, saying that she had just slept badly last night, so he didn't have to worry about it. She was fine. Then Carlyle looked away and asked if she'd had breakfast. She said she wasn't really hungry, so she hadn't had breakfast. But at the same moment, he called the butler to him, saying that he had not really eaten yet either, and inquired if she would like to have breakfast together, and turning to the servant, asked him to bring them food. When the butler had gone, Carlyle, smiling, said that he could see she had already made her choice, for otherwise she would not have come. Rebecca looked quite serious, and said that she had already made a choice, namely one in which she was accepting his offer. They were silent for a while. Then the man asked if he could ask what had influenced her decision. He attributed his concern to the fact that she had seemed unsure before, and he thought this decision might take longer than it actually turned out to be. At this moment, the maids had already entered the room and brought breakfast, and the girl was glad, for she turned the subject at once to food. Carlyle looked at the wagon and said that the chef had prepared a rather tasty soup that would even substitute in the capital, so he asked that the girl still taste it and give her opinion. Soon there was already a lot of stuff on the table, and Rebecca immediately began to eat. As soon as she tasted the first buns, she felt better, for the food was very tasty. The man, who had also started his breakfast, suddenly started watching her and smiled at the way she was trying to eat everything as soon as possible. However, at the same time trying to observe some manners. But at this time the butler stood behind them and was very wary, for he knew that His Highness had already had breakfast. But here he suddenly told her that he had not, and ordered another. They were silent for a while, and then Rebecca said that the soup was really quite good. The man smiled and said he was glad she liked it. When they had finished everything, Carlyle said that as long as their pact was valid, he would consider her one of his men, even if it was a false engagement. He promises to treat her with all his respect. When Rebecca heard this, she was very surprised and even a little embarrassed. She thanked him for that and said that she also promised him the same. She hesitated for a while about whether she should tell him, but then she decided, and said that she wasn't really even sure how much she could tell him about her situation. The girl immediately became very sad, but Carlyle replied that she could talk about anything she wanted. He wouldn't even care if she started swearing and had no manners. When the girl heard this, she was indignant, and stood up from her seat and replied that not at all. She would not dare to neither swear nor tell her situation in front of his lordship. The man smiled at her and said that what she called him sounded too formal, so he suggested we just call each other by their first names, and told her to sit down already, because everything was fine. As Rebecca took her seat, he said that he thought they had quite a bit in common. After all, they both don't aspire to be part of high society and want to do other things that they just love. The girl, smiling, said that was perfectly true, since he wanted it. That is, as he said he wanted it. Then she would agree to their contract. Carlyle insisted, and asked her what had happened that had made her make this decision so quickly. After thinking about it, Rebecca decided to tell him the truth after all. And after a while, when he heard the full story, he felt a little uneasy himself. There was an awkward silence between them for a while. Rebecca said that it had been her dream to become an alchemist since she was a child, and when she had visited her father's workshop for the first time, she had experienced indescribable emotions. And while others were noticing the label and learning how to style their hair and sew to become the very best ladies for their husbands, she was with her father and practicing alchemy. At the age of 15, she had already managed to pass the exam with the highest score. Like all other people, she thought that this gave her a special position because she had achieved the best result. Rebecca really thought that everyone in the workshop and in her family recognized her in the industry. Last night, however, she learned the whole truth. This truth turned out to be very bitter. All this time, no one had ever seen her as an alchemist or a scientist. They all just pretended to believe in her and her abilities, when really they were just waiting for her to finally get married sooner rather than later. Then Rebecca turned to Carlyle and asked if he too saw her as just a fake. The man immediately said that was not the case at all. He knew that she was the most diligent and dedicated alchemist that had ever existed. She looked at him in surprise and couldn't believe it was really true, and then she wondered how he could be so sure of it. Carlyle, smiling, said that all her hands were a clear testament to her hard work. Her scar on her index finger looks like a cut from a small knife, and next to that scar there is also a small burn mark and a serious wound on her thumb. What was even more noticeable, however, were her numerous calluses. Rebecca wondered if he'd really noticed them, since she'd tried so hard to hide them. But the man, laughing, replied that honing his skills as a swordsman was paying off. Laughing, the girl asked if it was true that it was simply unbelievable that these hands belonged to a true noblewoman. She had been scolded for it so many times. Carlyle suddenly became very serious and said that he didn't think it was worth scolding at all for that, because it was an indication of her hard work. Rebecca, hearing all these words, was very moved. She was incredibly pleased that someone actually noticed that she was working hard to achieve results. She immediately began wiping away her tears that had flowed and apologized to him, telling him that she had been too emotional lately. But at that moment, he took a small handkerchief out of his pocket and handed it to the girl, asking if she would accept his second handkerchief. Rebecca immediately took it and thanked him, saying that an unshakable determination now enveloped her. She swears to herself that she will fight, so that her family will finally see her as a true alchemist. Soon the contract was finally drawn up, and the man gave it to the girl to study and sign. Rebecca began to scrutinize the contents of the contract to make sure she hadn't missed anything, and that everything was correct there. Carlyle, for his part, watched her and didn't understand how anyone could even call her dreams childish when she worked so hard. He was silent for a while, and then said that in fact, when he first picked up the sword, his teacher had said that he had never before seen a child with such a terrible rack. Rebecca, hearing this, was immediately distracted from the contract and asked if it was really true, since she had thought he was a professional since he was a child. The girl also asked how it was possible that he was a great swordsman in their empire. The man replied that it was because he kept trying and didn't give up, despite what everyone around him told him that he was failing and that it was better to give up altogether. Those who give their best to their favorite work do not give in to criticism and ridicule, always achieve what they want. Will and perseverance lead them to success. That's why Carlyle is confident that sooner or later the girl's efforts will be rewarded. Rebecca, when she heard all these words of support, was incredibly happy, and her cheeks even blushed a little. She smiled and thanked him for his support and understanding, and shortly thereafter, they both signed an agreement for a prenuptial agreement. From that moment on, Rebecca's new life began. One day, Mother Carlyle got together with her daughter, to whom she told all the latest news. When Charlotte, who was the man's younger sister, heard this, she wondered if he really had a contractual engagement. The woman sighed heavily and said that she had heard right. She couldn't imagine what kind of person he was to make such stupid and rash decisions. Charlotte thought at that moment that he must be all over his mother because she had always been like that. But the woman in turn said that she was sure her brother, the former emperor, already knew about the scheme. Carlyle's sister asked that she just forget about him, because she felt insanely sorry for the young lady. She wouldn't even get anything out of it. If her engagement ended in 2 years, the other nobles would probably be all sorted out by now. Then she looked at her mother's calm face and said that she probably already knew this. This girl will find it incredibly difficult to find another person to marry. In the end, she even risks being left completely alone. Mother, upon reflection, said that this was indeed true. Moreover, the proposal was unfavorable to the noblewoman. Charlotte agreed and said it was only natural. So she turned to Carlyle afterwards and said that he now needed to come up with another solution because this wasn't suitable. Seeing his completely calm and unperturbed face, she told him not to sit there as if it was completely none of his business. Carlyle thought for a while and said that the contract had already been signed. When Mother heard this, she was very much surprised, for she had not known it, and his sister, raising her voice, asked if he had really signed it with Lady Rebecca. She also said that this girl might be a bit of an odd lady for Duchess status. Carlyle looked at her in surprise and asked why she thought so. But anyway, even if it really was Lady Rebecca, who in their right mind would even agree to such an offer? Charlotte said that maybe there was just a miscommunication between them, and she didn't fully understand the terms. The man got up from the couch and said she would understand once she saw Rebecca. He didn't want to explain anything now. Mother then suddenly began to smile and said that because her weirdo brother didn't have a son, Rebecca was a patient and kind woman. Charlotte agreed with her and jumped up and said that was right, because his face was begging for a slap after something like that. She wondered if it was the other way around. If perhaps this lady was the one who was deceiving Carlyle. Charlotte also asked her brother if he remembered that when he was only 15, some woman disguised herself as a maid in order to get into his room. So there was also a lady who threatened her herself if he refused to take her as his wife. She said there had been a woman who had acted as if she were already his wife, and there had been a time when a girl had jumped on him naked. Charlotte wondered if Lady Rebecca was one of those. When she saw Carlyle leaving, she asked what he was even going to do. The man replied that he would take Rebecca to lunch in a few days and formally introduce her to them. Charlotte was still indignant if she wanted to add anything. However, the man had already gone out the door and heard nothing. Carlyle sighed heavily, thinking about how Rebecca was completely different from everyone else, and he was very glad that she hadn't changed since he first saw her. Remembering all of this, the man smiled and blushed a little. He went on about his business. Soon rumors spread throughout society that the Duke of Rowanster was now engaged. The girls were shocked and very disappointed, as many were crazy about him and even thought they were in love. One of the women said that the Duke was practically their common love, and the other in turn wondered which of them could win his heart finally. Soon after, they heard a name, namely about Lady Rebecca, and that's when other rumors began to spread. Is she even who she is? They also speculated that she was probably just the woman who was acting incredibly strange. They couldn't believe that it could really be that strange woman who doesn't follow fashion and doesn't even know how to wear a dress, and who was even recently convicted for reading a book at a party. One of the ladies at the party said that both families had officially confirmed it. Another was very surprised and asked, "What about Lady Carseus? What will happen to her now?" Others did not know what Lady Haley would do now, for she herself had said she was going to marry the Duke. The ladies agreed that they are incredibly upset, so it's hard for them to even imagine how disappointed Haley is. They believe that she is very embarrassed and not even ready to go out in public after hearing the news. Some of them had heard that she had even canceled all invitations to tea parties, citing illness. But the ladies doubted very much that she was really ill and was refusing everyone because of it. One of the girls said that she would actually do that too, because it would make her feel ashamed in front of the people around her. After all, she had really convinced everyone around her that she would marry him, and then some other girl came along and beat her to it. At this time, Lady Haley was at her manor. She was sitting in her room, locked up, and would not come out. One day her father did come in, and turning to her, asked what was the matter with her, for she had not left her chambers for too long. There was broken glass, and even drops of blood lying next to the girl. The man was a little wary when he saw all this, and she, in turn, turned to her father, asking if he had heard the latest news that everyone was discussing. She also added by saying about Carlyle getting engaged. However, sadly not to her, but to Lady Rebecca. The girl stood near the window and said in a sad voice that of all people he had chosen this odd lady. Her father turned to Haley and already wanted to comfort her somehow, but the girl was furious. She turned to him and told him that the idiot had stolen it from her. He, in turn, said that apparently more pressure was put on him by the emperor. That was why he had made such a decision. But Haley, for her part, said that she still doesn't understand why he chose that particular girl over her. After all, she tried so hard to please him all the time and helped him all the time. The man laughed nervously and said he thought it was all part of Carlisle's plan. He's clearly trying to buy time until the hatching tradition is over. Haley came closer to him and said that she couldn't take it anyway, and asked her father, did he even realize what a laughingstock she had become in front of everyone? The man tried to calm his daughter down, for she was indeed very excited. But she, in turn, said that she has asked Adelgate a great many times, but she still wants her son to make that decision. That's just an ungrateful old megger in her opinion. But she looked into her father's eyes and asked, does this woman even realize who was protecting Charlotte in high society? So she said that she was bound to break off this terrible engagement in some way. The man lowered his head and said that it was unfortunately beyond his power, and there was nothing he could do about it. The decision had been made, and he would not be affected by it in any way. He also said that the Aucklands are on fairly good terms with their family, and they're content to be helpful. But Haley interrupted him and said that it's only the Earl's humble home, so he should do something about it. But the man replied that they could in no way be compared to other houses of the same rank. It would not even be strange if they became marquises or dukes at this very second. The Aucklands manufacture absolutely all weapons for their empire, and are also fully engaged in repairing them. Haley sighed heavily and said that all their magic stuff was nothing without Cassius's confirmation. But the man replied that their house also had great influence in the empire, as they did. Therefore, do not underestimate the Oaklands. He told his daughter that they should by no means act rashly, but think through every move. But Haley was incredibly angry and asked what of it. She didn't see the point of it all anyway. Haley suddenly started screaming, asking her father if he really meant to say that she had no choice but to let this girl take Carlisle out from under her nose like that. He, in turn, asked in a calm voice why she necessarily wanted this particular man. If she wanted to, he could even make her queen, but the girl screamed, refusing to do so. She also said that he knew that only Carlisle could protect her properly, and that she needed that man to live in peace. The man was silent for a while. Then he turned to Haley and asked if she still hadn't recovered from what had happened. But the girl said in a rough voice that it was only his fault that she had become like this, and if her father is truly sorry, then he should do anything. But let her be with Carlisle. The girl also said that if she takes the case, she doesn't even know where it will lead. However, she knows for sure that it will definitely end badly. The man wanted to say something else to Haley, but she had already turned around and wasn't going to listen to him. The girl just didn't understand how it was that Rebecca had dared to separate her along with Carlisle. It was her nemesis now. The next day, just as the man had said, Rebecca did arrive at their estate to meet the whole family. The girl was quite serious, so she put on a very smart dress, and as soon as she approached Carlisle's mother and his sister, she immediately bowed, greeting them. The women stood at some distance from her. The girl in turn introduced herself and said that it was a great honor to meet them, and she was very glad that it had happened. Carlisle's mother laughed and said they too were incredibly excited to finally meet her, and Charlotte asked her not to worry too much. They just wanted to meet her before they got engaged, so it wasn't a big deal. It was just a casual dinner. But of course, Rebecca was incredibly concerned, because she knew it wasn't as simple as they said. Charlotte, in turn, said that they wanted to get to know her as well as possible, and Mother then added that she deserved an apology after all. Rebecca looked at them in surprise, not knowing what they were talking about. The woman, in turn, explained that she had been told that the girl herself needed this engagement. However, she realized that this deal could be quite unfavorable for her as a noblewoman. The woman would also like to apologize on behalf of her son for this behavior, and for putting her in such an embarrassing position. Rebecca looked at them in surprise and then wondered why they thought this deal would be a disadvantage to her. Charlotte and her mother were very surprised at this question. After all, they thought it was quite natural. Then Carlisle's mother said she absolutely did not need to defend him that much. Rebecca looked at them in surprise, and didn't understand why they thought she was protecting him. And then, a little embarrassed, she looked away and said that there must be something she didn't understand about the situation. She then apologized to Madame Adelheid for having no way of knowing what they were even talking about. But the girl laughed with her daughter and said that she did not have to apologize to them at all. But then she became more serious and asked if the girl was sure she wanted to sign the contract and get married. Rebecca, putting her head down, said quite rightly, it was as necessary for her as it was for the Duke. But then she turned to Madame and Lady Charlotte and said that it was their opinion on the subject that she wished to hear, for it seemed to her that they had certain doubts. The girls looked at each other, and then Madame Adelheid said that if it suited them both, she had no objection. Charlotte answered in the same way herself. After that she ran up to Rebecca and told her that she could also just address her by her first name, since technically they were about to become pretty close to each other. Charlotte also smiled and said that Carlyle had told her that she was eager to continue her fascination with alchemy when she got here. Rebecca was a little surprised at this girl's behavior, but said it was true, and wondered if she could really do it here. Carlyle's sister said that, of course, if she did something interesting, they would even love to see it and try out her experiments. She also said that she had quite recently finished reading a book about the magic lighthouse. When Rebecca heard this, she asked if she was really talking about the magic lighthouse of Manhwa now. The girls immediately laughed and sparkled with happiness, for they had found common ground with each other. Mother, who continued to stand to the side, just watched it all in silence. She was pleased that Charlotte had made friends with her. At that moment, Carlyle had already approached them. He immediately bowed to Rebecca and said hello. And soon they were in the garden gazebo talking. Quite a lot of time had passed since then. They had discussed completely different things, and everyone was satisfied with the end of the evening. As the sun began to sink below the horizon, Rebecca bowed before Mistress and Lady Charlotte in farewell. They in turn waved goodbye. Then she simply got into the carriage and drove away. Carlyle walked her a little way and also said goodbye. As the carriage began to leave, Charlotte turned to her mother and asked her what she thought. The woman herself said that she wanted to ask her the same thing. When Sister Carla, upon reflection, said that perhaps this girl stood out from the rest after all, it was easy to see what she was thinking. Adelheid agreed with her and said that even though she was being polite, she clearly did not feel at ease in high society. They set off in the direction of the estate. Charlotte also said that she was rather glad she had not had to feel nervous, and wondered about Mother, whether she had felt comfortable during their dinner. The woman said thoughtfully that she found Rebecca a bit odd, but she liked her nonetheless, a rather nice girl and sincere. Charlotte suddenly frowned and said that despite all of this, her makeup and dresses were a little too much. They basically didn't suit her at all. Mother, smiling, said that she had noticed it too, so she would definitely need her help during the ceremony to find the right outfit. Carlyle, for his part, continued to stand in the same place for a while longer, watching the carriage. He also enjoyed the evening very much. And so, after a few days, the long-awaited engagement day arrived. Everything around the manor was already decorated, and the servants were still doing some errands for the mistress to make everything perfect. Rebecca, who had arrived a little earlier than planned, walked past them and looked around nervously. Everyone around them was bustling and hurrying to get everything done. Rebecca's heart was pounding incredibly fast and loud. The thought that this was the day she would be engaged was very disturbing. As she walked by, she looked around and noticed that everything looked just fine. Roaming had taken charge of the preparations and even the financial arrangements. Even though Judith was insanely happy that they would be able to keep their finances together, she still planned to spend it on buying a new dress for herself. The girl didn't know if that would really be the right decision on her part. Charlotte suddenly walked up to her, and when she saw Rebecca, she stopped in place. She was incredibly surprised. She said hello to her in turn. When Carla's sister ran up to her, she smiled and said that she had come just delightfully dressed. Rebecca laughed nervously, saying that she really had, since her brother's lover had insisted on the outfit. She really put quite a bit of effort into this look. However, Charlotte still thinks that she could go for a different style that would be even more graceful and suitable for the whole situation. So she took the girl's hand and led her towards the manor, telling her to follow her. After all, they would be perfecting this situation now. Carlyle was in his room at the time, and he had already put on his costume. But he was uncomfortable, because it was so tight that it was hard to breathe. However, he simply had to endure at least one day in such an outfit, in order for his mother to be satisfied and not scold him. When he had finished dressing up, the butler came in and bowed and said hello, telling him that Lady Rebecca was about to come down, so he'd better get ready. And indeed, after a few minutes, the girl began to descend. She was dressed simply delightful. Her dress was emerald, her makeup was completely different, more natural, and her hair was braided up, which emphasized her beautiful face even better. When Carlyle saw his fictitious bride, he couldn't even say a word. He was so surprised by her beautiful appearance that he just stood there staring at her. Soon, when the girl came down completely, she said hello to him, and the man asked in surprise if it was definitely her. Rebecca laughed and said that of course it was her. When the man came closer and said that he was amazed at how she had changed, because it was as if she was a completely different person now. She smiled back at him and asked if she understood that it was a compliment from him. Carlyle couldn't take his eyes off her, and said that of course it was the sincerest compliment from him. He stood silent for a while, then bowed and apologized to her, saying that he felt incredibly surprised that he couldn't even find the right words to express how he felt about her appearance. Rebecca in turn replied that it was all thanks to Charlotte, who had helped her find the right outfit. In fact, the girl herself was shocked when she saw her reflection in the mirror, and she realized that Charlotte was quite the tryhard. And the moment the girl saw herself in that beautiful outfit, she realized that she really looked incredibly like her mother, and she felt insanely sorry, because she wished so much that she was alive to support her in such a situation. But she also wasn't sure if her mom would have supported her choice and approved of these actions she was taking now. Then Carlyle took the girl's hand and kissed it as a sign of greeting and respect. When Rebecca saw it all, she was frozen with surprise and couldn't believe it was really happening. Charlotte, who in turn was standing nearby, was incredibly surprised and shocked. She could not believe that her brother had now taken and kissed the girl's hand, though he had never done so and had always been judgmental. When Carlyle finished doing this, he looked at her palms in surprise, unable to comprehend what he had even just done. He himself didn't know how it had happened. The man also suggested that he was probably out of line. However, Rebecca was a little surprised, and thought that he was probably just used to it since he was popular with everyone. So to make it less awkward for both of them, she said that she was probably already expecting them. The man immediately pulled away from her and said that they should probably go into the hall already, so as not to make the guests wait so long. Rebecca came close to him and put her arm around his elbow. Soon the doors opened, and they stepped outside, where there were many guests waiting, and everything was decorated. Absolutely all the relatives and other people from high society had already gathered. They were talking, discussing various news and drinking wine. In fact, Hayes looked around, a little disappointed even, when the newlyweds wanted to gather so many close relatives. But once his daughter stepped out with the groom, he realized that despite all the controversy, there was no denying that this ceremony was still pretty impressive and grand. He turned to Will, who was standing nearby, and said that Roaming had really worked hard on making everything perfect. The guy in turn said that apparently they did spend quite a bit of money on it. However, he also heard about them mentioning that the wedding would be even more magnificent, although he doesn't know what could be even more gorgeous. For their part, Rebecca and Carlyle had already walked down the aisle, where a special male organist was waiting for them, and asked if they were ready to begin the engagement ceremony already. They said that of course they were ready, and the man began his speech. He spoke of how, under the blessing of the great Artel, these two future spouses would end up together and would carry their happiness and sorrow for the rest of their lives. Judith, who sat watching all this, thought about the fact that all those dresses and jewelry Rebecca was wearing must have cost a fortune. Hames in turn sat down next to Carlyle's mother and said that he was sure she would take excellent care of Rebecca. The woman laughed and said that he had entrusted them with the care of his precious daughter, and she promised him that she would do absolutely everything possible to make the girl comfortable in this place. But really the girl felt guilty for her son's actions, and that was rather hard for her to accept, especially knowing that the bride's parents knew nothing about it. Soon the official ceremony was finally over, and all the people could just relax and have fun. A little girl with a basket of petals ran and scattered them around the young people, and said that she was congratulating them on their engagement. Rebecca and Carlyle watched it all happily. The girl thought it was a nice gesture and kept laughing at the little girl. But then suddenly, after a while, Will began to approach them. He turned to Rebecca and congratulated her. The man also said he sincerely apologizes for what happened at the workshop. When the girl heard this, she looked at him with a frown and realized that surely his guilt was obvious, and she was certainly unwilling to forgive him. Well, as far as Locke was concerned, he was really supportive. He saved and gave her a huge box of her personal belongings. The boy told her to be sure to keep it all from William. The girl, when she saw it, shone with joy. Locke in turn explained that he had carefully kept all her notes and creations, for he had always wanted to give them to her. The girl thanked him at once, and he lowered his head and apologized for not being able to protect her from this William, and disappointed with himself as an older brother. Rebecca, when she heard those words, asked in surprise what he was even talking about, because he was the best big brother ever, and she was proud to call him that. Then Locke put his hands on her shoulders and told her to remember once and for all. He always thought she was the most delightful alchemist he had ever met. So he asks her not to give up, but to keep practicing and improving in alchemy. Then she will achieve great success, and he will be proud to be her elder brother. And now Rebecca was incredibly grateful to him for being so supportive. Soon William's wife approached her. She laughed, turned to her and asked if it was true that it was all because of her, and asked that she by no means forget it. Rebecca looked at her in surprise and didn't know what to say. He turned to his dear daughter and congratulated her on her engagement. Rebecca was delighted to see him and thanked him for his congratulations. Then all the others withdrew, leaving them alone. Hames bowed to Carlyle and said that he hoped he would take good care of her. The man bowed back and said that, of course, he promised that he would make her happy and not let her be hurt in any way. The young people then proceeded to walk around the grounds, accepting congratulations from guests and saying hello to everyone. Carlyle leaned closer to her and said that everything had been so fast and hectic that he had even forgotten to tell her something. The girl looked at him in surprise and asked him what it was that he had wanted to tell her, and he said that at last the annex had been completely rebuilt into her personal workshop. When the girl heard this, she glowed with joy and imagined how she would work there. And the man in turn was pleased when he saw her joyful expression and said that indeed, her personal workshop was ready and she would be able to start work very soon. He also said that he had promised her that she would not regret this agreement, and after saying these words he smiled. Rebecca stared at him in surprise for a while. Then they returned to the celebration, which lasted well into the evening, and as the sun began to sink below the horizon, the guests finally dispersed. Then the girl had stayed the night at Carlisle Manor after all, and she was pacing from side to side, incredibly nervous. A maid named Rosalind was Rebecca's personal maid, and she was just sweeping the floor of her room. The girl turned to her and asked that she try not to move that way, as it was raising even more dust and making her job more difficult. Rebecca looked at the door and sighed heavily, saying that he was late, and she couldn't help but worry. And when she was worried, she paced nervously, because she needed something to do. Rosalind, smiling, said that she was quite sure he would be here soon because he had so much to do. Besides, she was sure that things were quite different at the Duke's estate. Rebecca looked at her in surprise and asked what that even meant. Then the maid stepped forward and asked her to look at this beautiful room, for it was filled with splendid objects of the highest quality that could be found. It turns out that the rumors were indeed true, and this Romance Zadorov estate turned out to be as magnificent as the Imperial Palace. Rebecca actually looked around and noticed a lot of different things she hadn't noticed before, and asked Rosalind if she really thought so. The maid had no time to answer, for there was a knock at their room. The door opened at once, and they saw Carlyle smiling at them. The man went into the room and came closer to Rebecca and asked her if she liked the room he had picked up. She replied that it was wonderful, and she really liked it very much. She was radiant with joy. However, she still had bruises and bruises on her arms that would not heal. Carlyle smiled when he saw how happy she was, and realized that every time he met her, his face just blurred into a smile, and he didn't know why that was. After all, until this moment, he had no idea that he had never been this happy before. They were silent for a while. Then the man apologized for keeping her waiting for so long, and said that they could go now, for he had taken care of all his business. They went outside, and Carlyle said that the annex wasn't that far from the estate, so it wouldn't be a problem for her to get there any time. He went on and on. He said it might seem small to her at first, but he hoped she would still like the end result. But at that moment Rebecca suddenly stopped, and seeing the building in front of her, asked if this was really the workshop he was talking about. She couldn't believe her eyes, for he had claimed it was just an outhouse. She could not believe her eyes, for he had claimed it was just an outhouse. Carlyle in turn said that it was exactly the same extension. He'd left it as it was on the outside, but he'd redone absolutely everything inside to make her comfortable. When they got inside, Rebecca assumed that he had probably decided to remodel one of the rooms for her work, so it probably wasn't the whole building for her. However, as soon as they walked in, she saw a huge room that took up the entire space, and her eyes widened so much you'd think they were about to fall out. Rebecca had expected to see many things, knowing its condition, but certainly not what appeared before her. It was incredibly large, spacious, and packed with things she'd never dreamed of. She blushed and said in a shaky voice that it just couldn't be. The girl walked forward, turned to him and asked if this was really her workshop. Carlyle, smiling, said that was absolutely right. This whole place belonged to her now. She could create here. When she asked, shrieking, if this beautiful, spacious workshop was now entirely hers, the man remained standing still and asked if she liked the place. She ran to him in surprise and asked him how he could even ask such a question, because no alchemist would dare to express his dissatisfaction with this place, because everything in it was perfect. Rebecca walked from one corner to the other for a while, looking at the various jars and instruments for experiments, and just couldn't believe her happiness. The man in his line stayed put and smiled the whole time. He said that he had worked very hard to make sure that the place was stocked with the best first-class tools, so that nothing would hinder her work. Rebecca took one of the jars in her hands and said that now she understood exactly why the girls were so obsessed with it. When he heard that, he was very surprised and asked if that was really true. But he thought to himself that she wasn't like that, and didn't even look at him that way. Rosalia followed them to see if all was well. When she saw the workshop, she didn't understand how his lordship had even realized what Lady Rebecca preferred. However, she realized that it didn't matter at all. She just wondered if it was normal, because Lady Rebecca was sure to go crazy soon this way. But she was an adult, so she assumed it would be fine. She could take care of herself. The next morning when Rebecca opened her eyes, she was frightened for a while, for she did not realize where she was. But then she remembered that she was now living at Rowanster Manor. The girl sat up on the bed and stretched, realizing that before she thought she wouldn't be able to sleep in a new place. But in fact she slept like a dead person, because the bed was incredibly comfortable and soft. She looked out the window, wondering if it was still morning, but seeing that the sun was just starting to rise, she realized that she would have to wait a few more hours before going to the workshop, because she had woken up too early. But then she suddenly stopped herself at that thought, remembering that she now had her own workshop, and didn't have to wait for an opening and other people to start working. So Rebecca immediately jumped up from her bed and ran toward the exit. But then she heard Rosalie's voice asking her to stop. She said, smiling, knowing full well that Mistress would try to do that. Rebecca looked at her in surprise, not sure what she wanted her to do. The maid in turn showed her her new outfit, saying that it was now her new uniform to work in. Rebecca looked at this and was ready to scream and asked if it was really true and she wasn't dreaming. The maid gave her the new uniform, and didn't know whether to be happy that the girl still wasn't worried about her dresses, and was so excited about some workshop uniform. Rebecca looked at it from all sides, and said happily that it had an incredible number of pockets. The maid replied that she had added some on purpose, so that there would be something to put in it, and the girl said that it was the best. She ran up and hugged her, and told her that she loved her unbelievably. The maid asked if she could direct that love to someone else, since she didn't really like being touched. Soon Rebecca finally changed into her new uniform, which was incredibly beautiful and went very well with her gray eyes, and said that in that case she would go to the workshop already. But the maid asked, decreed big, "What about breakfast?" Tam in turn said she would deal with that later. Right now she was obliged to just sit in the workshop. Rosalia was a little worried, not knowing what she should even do in such a situation. She realized that someone had to stop this madness of Mistress Rebecca's. However, of course, it would not be her. So the girl had no choice but to follow her into the workshop. But as soon as Rebecca ran out into the hallway, she immediately saw Carlyle in front of her, who was also in his work uniform, and when he saw her, he stopped and looked at her in surprise. She ran past him very quickly and wished him good morning. The man in turn bowed and also said hello to her. However, she didn't even stop. Carlyle looked at her in surprise and asked her where she was going in the morning. She answered that she had woken up early, so she was going to the workshop, and said goodbye to him, because she wasn't going to be late. The man was a little surprised at this behavior, but smiled and realized that he was glad after all, that she liked it a lot, and he was even pleased that she was happy with her life here. But in fact, he was even a little disappointed. Soon Rebecca finally came running to her workshop, and as soon as she opened the door, she froze again in surprise. She had forgotten how beautiful she was overnight. For a while she just stood there, staring. But then she realized, overjoyed, that it was all hers now. She was incredibly happy and proud that she had made the right decision. Soon everyone had already managed to wake up together. The mistress was sitting up and sorting out some papers. She turned to the maid and told her to have her fix it for them. The maid said she would be sure to do so. Then, thinking about it, she wondered how Rebecca was doing. She replied that this girl spent a lot of time in the annex, or rather in her workshop. When she heard this, she asked in surprise, "Is that really all they can say?" The maid replied that she wasn't quite sure what else she could add. The mistress then asked, "Doesn't even the head maid know anything about this?" And then wondered, has she not left her workshop at all in all this time? Toward evening, Mistress called Rebecca's personal maid, who had come from her parents' estate with her, and inquired if the girl was all right. Rasulu, they were able to answer something right away. Mistress then suggested that she must be feeling intimidated in their large and new estate, but she shouldn't worry so much. Everything was fine. She also said that she wanted them to feel comfortable, just like at home. But then suddenly, Rosalia couldn't stand it and turned to Madame. She asked that the mistress stop this Rebecca because she is straight up going crazy in this workshop. When it was beginning to be evening, she did get ready, and together with the maid and the head maid they went to Rebecca's workshop. Rosalia turned to the girl and said that Madame Adelgate had arrived. Rebecca, of course, heard nothing. She spoke her thoughts aloud, not understanding why she was failing, because everything should have been right according to her calculations. Rosalia then tried to approach her again to get her to pay attention to them. But it was no use. Rebecca didn't understand why this was happening, and decided she had to use a different formula. The maid began to shout louder, but that didn't work either. Then Madame Adelheid came up to them and shouted at Rebecca. She immediately jumped up in surprise and screamed all over her workshop. You see, she was very frightened. Turning to the side, she saw Mother Carlyle in front of her, and was very much surprised, but in turn said that she could see perfectly well now why her maid had asked for help so much. She started yelling at the girl, saying that she should definitely be reprimanded for such behavior. She understands that the girl is passionate about alchemy and takes it seriously, but such behavior is simply unacceptable. She said that even Carlyle, who has surpassed human capabilities, still eats, sleeps, and does other things to distract himself from his training. When she inquired if the girl even knew how many days it had been, she moved closer to her and told her in a softer voice to just look at her face. She's sure her mom would be upset if she saw her in that condition. Rebecca looked at her in surprise and asked the madam, did she really know her mom? The woman said that of course they knew each other. Madame Adelheid said she was quite sure that in any high society they knew her. But that was not the point at all now. She started yelling again, saying that even though it was a contract engagement, she was still her son's bride, and as long as the contract was valid, she would be her man too. She would be their entire family. Rebecca was a little embarrassed, but thanked her for those words. Mistress said she would never allow her family to be neglected like that. She then turned to the Cardona and said that from now on, if Rebecca missed a meal or refused to sleep, she was to inform the head maid immediately. And when the head maid found out about it, she must straightway get Rebecca out of the workshop, even if she had to call all the servants to help. Rebecca turned to the madam in a trembling voice and told her that she needed to work on her project some more in order for it to work out. However, the woman did not want to listen to anything. She said that if she continued to be stubborn like that, she would simply ban her from the workshop. When the girl heard this, she was just shocked and could not answer anything. Then Rosalia took her by the hand and offered to eat to mistress and sleep a little. When they had gone, Madame Adelheid stood silent for some time. Afterward she said that all this girl was probably thinking about was her alchemy. She waved her head. "So," she said, "Carlyle also neglected himself when he was training with the sword, and she thinks people like that are absolutely no help at all. Not only should they figure out for themselves what they want and how to take their rest." Soon Rebecca was forced to come to the manor after all. She was sitting in the living room eating a sandwich. Carlyle came to her shortly afterward, and turning to her, said he had heard from Charlotte that she finally wanted to eat. The girl sat and ate for some time with tears in her eyes. And then she said that not at all. She had come here because Madame Adelgate had counted her out. She said she just had to eat, or she would forbid her to enter the workshop. Carlyle was a little surprised, but then said that if she didn't want mistress to scold her, he could talk. But the girl replied that there was no need to do that, and she was fine. To be honest, this woman even reminded her of her mom at one point, so it wasn't all that bad, so you don't have to talk to her about it. The man sat down next to her and said he was fine now, and she in turn wondered what had brought him to this place. Carlyle explained that he had come to tell her the bad news. Rebecca looked at him in surprise and asked, "What's the other bad news?" He in turn smiled for a while. Then he started pulling something out of his pocket. He handed her an envelope with a letter, telling her that they had been invited to the Crown Prince's birthday party. And soon, the very day of the Crown Prince's birthday celebration finally arrived. The guests were all already gathered in the banquet room, and the ladies began discussing all the people who would be attending. But most of all, they were excited to finally see the face of this very strange lady. By strange lady, of course, they meant Rebecca. The girls didn't understand how on earth she could reject all their invitations, and it made them very angry. But one of the girls said that it was basically to be expected, because surely now that she was the bride of Duke Rowan Starr, she had a high opinion of herself. And then the butler announced to all the guests that the Duke of Carlisle and his lady Rebecca had finally arrived. As soon as they saw the couple, they couldn't believe their eyes, because Rebecca was incredibly beautiful, and Carlisle always had been. All the ladies didn't expect to see such a beautiful girl. I mean, they're used to her being called crazy. And here she is, just incredibly beautiful. One of the men who was standing nearby said that she was like a rough diamond, and it was even hard to think that there was a lady like her in high society, and no one had noticed her before. At that moment, Carlisle walked up to the Crown Prince and bowed and wished him a happy birthday, as did Rebecca. The little boy, who was just the son of the ruling emperor, was a little surprised but thanked them for their congratulations. Aubert, who was his father, also congratulated them on their engagement. The girl immediately thanked him. Carlyle had told her before to answer only to the point all the time, for they must not make mistakes. It was their first time out in public, but he was also surprised that the answer was quite short, so he apologized to His Majesty. But the latter replied that it was all right, for his father was waiting for him anyway, so they could go on their way without delay. Aubert himself was thinking at this point, and realized that these two looked a lot better than he thought they did, which surprised him quite a bit. When they had not gone far away, Carlyle turned to the girl, seeing that she was very much agitated, and asked in a whisper, "Is she not well?" Rebecca was very frightened when she heard this, as she didn't expect him to talk to her. But then she replied that she was fine. But the man insisted on his point and asked, in that case, what upset her? But the girl replied that she was fine and not upset. Then he asked why she was shy to express herself in such a case. At this point, even people began to pay attention to them, not understanding why they were standing aside and whispering. But Rebecca was tired of all this questioning, and she asked him to stop talking to her like that. She said it too loudly, which made the guy jump. The girl also explained that she was just trying to speak only business, so that she would not make any mistake. The man, hearing this, was very surprised, and did not understand what mistakes could be talked about at all. Rebecca explained that Charlotte and Madame Adiguerre had picked out this dress for her, but when she said how much she liked it, they suddenly laughed. The man immediately frowned and told her to just ignore Charlotte, but Rebecca replied that his mother had said she was a rather amusing young girl. Then Carlyle replied that he was quite sure she had said it as a compliment, not as an insult. Then she stepped aside and said that other people didn't think exactly the same way. The man suddenly smiled and asked, "Has she really kept quiet all this time and behaved rather modestly and unnaturally just because she is afraid to say something unnecessary?" Rebecca put her head down because of her sad feelings and said that if she made a mistake now, it would be very bad for his family and reputation, so she'd better keep quiet. She said so. She didn't want to make them all uncomfortable with her behavior and uneducated. Carlyle smiled when he heard all this. In fact, this speech even moved him. Then he thanked her for being so considerate, but said that he didn't want her to force herself like that. So it was okay for now. At least it was comforting. So he suggested that they get it over with and leave as they had planned. Rebecca smiled, for he was beginning to understand her and said that sounded pretty good. Soon they came to the already retired emperor. They bowed to him, the man greeting His Highness. The emperor, who was sitting on his throne, immediately smiled and congratulated the two of them on their engagement and asked if they liked his gift. Rebecca was surprised when she heard this, for she did not know what kind of gift they were talking about. Then Carlyle whispered in her ear that the former emperor had given them a mansion in the south. When she heard that, she couldn't contain her surprise. She thought it was a little too much, but she didn't say it. The emperor in turn looked at the man in surprise and asked if he had really just told her that. Rebecca bowed and said she was deeply honored and incredibly grateful for such a generous gift from him. However, the emperor smiled and said that it was just a small gesture of attention to them for the engagement. He choked suddenly and turned to Carlyle and asked him to fetch him a glass of wine, for his throat was dry. They both looked a little surprised. However, the man turned around and started to walk out, telling His Highness that he would be back soon. Rebecca didn't understand why he was leaving her alone, for she was very afraid of saying the wrong thing until now. She didn't understand why the emperor would ask Carlyle when there were servants for that. But at that moment he stood up and said that it must be a little stuffy in this place. He said, smiling, that it would be quite nice for both of them to enjoy the fresh air in the garden, and asked if she would keep him company. Rebecca was a little surprised, and raising her voice said that of course she would go with him. Then they went into the garden, straight through the crowd. The girls immediately began to whisper. One of them said that Rebecca must have already won the former emperor's favor. Another replied that they should be on good terms with her family now, because otherwise they would regret it. Soon, the girl and the emperor went outside together, and he then immediately addressed her. She was frightened the whole time he addressed her because of the fact that he was so highly honored. However, the emperor inquired in a stern voice what her relations were with Carlyle. Rebecca was very surprised to hear this and asked him what he meant. Rebecca said that they were engaged, after all, so they had a fairly close relationship. But the emperor replied that she thought all these procedures were just formalities. However, he also told her not to worry. He thought Carlyle would think of something to avoid it, though he didn't expect Rebecca to be involved in all these games. He was quite surprised to see them together at this event, so he had certain new questions. Then the emperor asked the lady if she had ever even met Carlyle before. The girl replied anxiously that she was not at all. They had only recently met. The man looked at her sternly and asked if it was really true. Rebecca laughed nervously and replied that he probably knew she hardly ever participated in social events, so they couldn't have met anywhere before. That day, when she had gone to Rowenster Manor after receiving the letter, she had met him for the first time. The man was a little wary, but said he understood now. But he didn't really believe her, for it seemed to him that Carlyle was incredibly in love with her, and that wasn't like him at all. He certainly wouldn't have fallen in love the first time he met her. Rebecca, seeing him looking at her sadly, asked if anything else was bothering him. Then the man said that he had never seen Carlyle look at a girl for so long, or smile so casually at her, and wondered if maybe they really loved each other and were meant to be together. When Rebecca heard this, she immediately cried out and said that it could never be. The emperor, after thinking about it, said that she should not deny it so much, but after that, he smiled at her and told her that it was okay after all. Rebecca was a little confused about what he was saying, but then said that she still thought he had misunderstood a little, and that was why there had been this misunderstanding. By then Carlyle had already approached them, and he turned to the old emperor, asking that he not torment his dear bride. Rebecca was immediately glad when she saw him, for it meant the end of awkward conversations with the emperor. The man was holding 2 glasses of wine. The emperor came closer to them and told them that he had arrived just in time, and asked why the man had been so late. Carlyle, handing him the glass, said that he had just had to look a bit for the wine he was drinking. And besides, they had gone out into the garden, without telling him anything, so he had to go back. The emperor in turn took the wine and began to leave, thanking him and telling him to enjoy the evening, and he would already go to rest, for he had become too old for such events. Rebecca, because she was still very worried, said goodbye to His Highness very loudly, wishing him a good rest. When she turned back to Carlyle, he held out a wine glass to her. When the emperor had already started to leave, he turned around, and when he saw the boy's radiant smile, he realized that something would happen to his heart very soon. Soon they were alone, and Carlyle asked the girl what His Majesty had been telling him all this time. Rebecca was a little embarrassed. She didn't know if she should tell him, but she made up her mind and replied that he knew about them pretending. When Carlyle heard this, he was really surprised and dumbfounded. He thought that their game was that good. However, the old emperor still found out the truth. Soon afterward they returned to the ball, in order that no one should suspect anything, and began to dance, discussing all matters. Carlyle questioned Rebecca again. Is it really true that the old emperor knows about them pretending? The girl replied that it was perfectly true and asked, "What shall they do now? And what will happen if he breaks their engagement?" "Well then," the guy smiled and said, "she shouldn't worry about it, because he expected it." When Rebecca heard this, she was very surprised and asked loudly, "How is that possible?" They continued to dance. Then she saw that everyone was turning on them, because she had said it too loudly, and in a quieter voice, she asked him if he was sure it would be okay. The boy, smiling, said that surely she should trust him. Rebecca wanted to object, but he bent her a little lower and said that everyone was looking at them like a pack of hungry wolves. Rebecca then, laughing nervously, asked, "Is this all because I'm such a bad dancer?" But Carlyle replied that he didn't think that was the point. After all, it was more like they were ready to pounce as soon as the dance was over. Seeing the way his fiancée was wary upon hearing this, he immediately told her not to worry, for he would definitely protect her at all costs. She immediately smiled back at him and thanked him, so she immediately started running away, saying that in that case, she would leave him because the music had already ended and all the people had stopped dancing. And so as soon as Rebecca stepped away for a bit, he was immediately surrounded by girls. Carlyle shouted loudly for her to come back, but the girl just laughed and ran farther away. Some wondered where his fiancée was in such a hurry, while others asked him to dance with them too. It wasn't long before Rebecca finally escaped to a private room in hopes of some alone time, and sat down on the couch, exhaling with relief that she could finally make it. But at that moment she heard the others. Yes, when they saw Rebecca, they said they were glad to meet her at last. The girl herself, seeing them in front of her, sighed heavily and realized that they had found her after all. One of the girls asked, "Is she really going to read a book in a separate place from everyone else again?" Rebecca, laughing, replied that not at all. She could not behave as she did before, for she was now of a completely different status. She is, after all, now the Duke's bride, and it would be rather impolite of her at such an important event to read. However, she herself at that moment remembered Charlotte's words that if anyone wanted to humiliate her, she just had to remind them that she was now of a rather high status. One of the girls was indignant and pointed in her direction and said that she couldn't accept someone like Rebecca, his lordship's fiancée. It just wasn't possible. The girl was very surprised that they responded so quickly, and then wondered, what's in it for her anyway? The lady was indignant and said it was rather impertinent of her, and then wondered, does she really think she deserves a man like Carlyle? Rebecca had already resented it then too, and said it was up to the two of them whether they accepted it or not. She didn't care at all. The girl continued to shout loudly, saying that she did not understand how Rebecca dared to speak his lordship's name so carelessly. But at that moment another lady came into the room and asked anxiously what was going on. It was Haley. She smiled when she saw Rebecca and said that now she realized where all the stars of the party were. The girls, when they saw her, immediately began to greet her, and she in turn said that it was no wonder that the dance hall was so dark. It was because the brightest flowers of the empire were hidden in this place. Then the girl who had attacked Rebecca explained to Haley that they just needed to talk to Mistress. Laughing, she asked what they wanted to talk to her about in the first place. For some time the girl hesitated to answer, and then said that it was rather hard for them to believe that Mrs. Rebecca had really become the Duke of Rowenster's bride. Haley smiled again, however insincerely, and wondered, what right did they have to complain about this anyway? And wondered if they could leave them alone for a moment, for she had something to say to Mrs. Rebecca. They started to leave, and the ladies were indignant. They disliked Haley, who thinks she's superior to everyone else. Rebecca was left alone with her then. Haley said, smiling, that she had been looking forward to meeting her mistress. The girl herself bowed and said that she had heard quite a bit about her and her family, so she was glad to meet her. Rebecca knew immediately that this was exactly who she needed to be wary of. After all, that's what Charlotte had said. Haley has a strong obsession, a particular obsession with her brother. Haley in turn became quite serious and said that she wanted to give Rebecca one very important piece of advice. The girl was already starting to get a little worried and asked what kind of advice we were talking about, but she tried to keep the face of a noble lady so as not to embarrass herself. Haley, in turn, turning to her, asked that the girl just break off this engagement. Rebecca, hearing this, was very surprised, and starting to scream, asked why she was saying that in the first place. But she became very serious and replied that the girl already knew the answer to that question. Or did she think she was smart because she was an alchemist? But she had never met anyone dumber than her. Rebecca was outraged and said that it was pretty rude of her to answer like that. But Haley insisted and said that she was the only one in the place who was really rude. She stole a place she has no right to. Rebecca looked at her in surprise and wondered what she was even talking about, for she really didn't understand anything. Haley stepped closer to her and asked, "Is she really that dumb?" And then she whispered that Carlyle had been hers from the beginning. He was born to protect her. Rebecca moved away from her and looked the girl straight in the eye and told her that Carlyle was not a thing she could own. He was a man who had his own choices. But Haley, frowning, said that the girl should have listened to her while she was being so kind, for otherwise things could only get worse. Rebecca looked up and told Miss Haley that she wasn't afraid of her at all, and these threats, in her opinion, were kindergarten. Haley looked at her in surprise, because she had expected a completely different reaction. Rebecca stood there satisfied, and said that Haley couldn't say anything, because she had no power. That's why she was wasting her time giving her stupid advice, hoping she'd listen to it. Rebecca raised her voice, saying that Haley could only wait until she decided to break off the engagement herself. Haley started yelling, calling her just a little girl who doesn't know anything. The girl then asked Haley, does she really love Carlyle or does she just want him to belong to her? Haley, angry, moved closer to her and asked her what that even meant. She also said that she would do absolutely anything to make him hers, so she wants Rebecca to leave him, or she'll just regret not listening to her sooner. But that's when Charlotte appeared out of nowhere. She slapped Haley so that she would move away and told her to stop doing that right now. Rebecca was incredibly surprised to see her, for she had never expected to see anyone but her. Haley in turn looked arrogantly at Charlotte and said that she wouldn't do that to her, would she? Haley is the reason Charlotte is high in the nobility, so she should know how to repay that kindness. Haley told the girl to get down on her knees right now and asked her how she even dared to go against her. Rebecca was very indignant when she heard that and said that now she could see what kind of person she really was. The girl, waving her hand, said that apparently the Rowensers took her kindness for granted, but Charlotte at this point said in a quiet voice that she did not recall anyone ever asking for her generosity and help. The girl also added that Haley was probably just helping her win her brother's favor, that's all. Haley suddenly laughed and then asked, does Charlotte really want to go back to the days when she was ridiculed as a widow who didn't even have her first wedding night? But the girl took Rebecca's hand and said that it was all completely irrelevant. She tried to stop Charlotte, but it was useless. Charlotte was too emotional to think rationally. Soon they were running out into the street, and Rebecca kept turning to Charlotte. Then the girl finally stopped and didn't turn to her. So Rebecca asked if she was okay. Charlotte was silent for a while and then told Rebecca that it was indeed true. She had been married once before. She said she married the son of the Marquis of Lonergan, who gave up his title to go out of town, and what Mrs. Haley said was true. She is indeed a widow. Charlotte explained that she had married him, and it was right after their wedding ceremony. They were tired after a long day and just wanted to rest, when suddenly an assassin burst into the house, targeting her husband. The assassin probably didn't want her brother to pursue him, since Carl was a master swordsman, so he didn't touch the girl. At that time, the Marquis actually had quite a few enemies. He was not a bad man, but he was very fond of power, so he opposed other houses without fearing the consequences that might appear. And after that night, the Marquis didn't want to let her go, so her family sued him to dissolve the marriage. In the end, Charlotte's family won and she was able to return home, but after that, their families became very feuding. The Marquis still resented her when she left the capital, most likely because his son was killed and she survived. Rebecca, when she heard the story, was very indignant and said that it wasn't Charlotte's fault. The girl smiled and said that she was right, yet people shunned her and called her a widow, so obviously she became an outcast in high society. Carlyle had told the girl in those days that she could only marry when she was well, or she could marry no one at all if she so desired. He would be sure to take care of her, whatever it cost him. Charlotte was incredibly grateful to him for that. But she really didn't want to burden him with her life. The girl wished she had something she was good at, like Rebecca being good at alchemy. Then she could make her own living and not worry. Then suddenly Rebecca took Charlotte's hand and suggested that they go back together. After all, they didn't have to stay in a place like this if they didn't want to, and suggested they go home. When Charlotte heard this, she was very surprised, but then smiling, told Rebecca that she certainly agreed. The next morning, the girl strolled through the garden to dispel a little of her gloomy thoughts from the previous evening. Suddenly, Charlotte heard someone shouting nearby. She immediately ran in that direction and heard someone say that it had worked after all. When the girl went behind the bushes, she saw Rebecca hanging from a tree and holding on very tightly. She immediately shouted her name. Rebecca in turn took off her glasses, and seeing Charlotte, said that she had frightened her very much. But the girl indignantly replied that she was the one who should have said it. Then Rebecca was able to climb down in one leap, and Charlotte wondered what she was even doing in the middle of the forest, and in a tree. The girl at this moment took out a small ball with wings and showed it to Charlotte, saying that they were special weapon-type magic tools. He can fly autonomously to attack enemies. However, Rebecca can't get him to move in the right direction. He's completely out of control and lives what seems like a life of his own. But Rebecca also said that luckily the thing had caught on a branch, so she was able to pick it up safely. When Charlotte heard this, she looked at her in surprise and asked if she had climbed the tree by herself. Rebecca, smiling, said that Alchemist should know how to get to any place to gather what she needed. It could be the top of a mountain or even the ocean. She could get to anywhere she needed to go. The girl looked at her with admiration and asked if it was working out to gather all the materials she needed. Rebecca, proudly holding her head up, replied that this was absolutely true. She had even completed basic strength training classes and begged her father to let her swim and climb. But then suddenly the girl began to scream, realizing that she should not have said it after all, and then whispered that Charlotte should not tell anyone about it. For if Rosaline or Madame Adelheid found out, they would scold her. Charlotte, laughing, said she agreed, and in return asked if she would like to have a cup of tea with her in the greenhouse. She also asked if she had been there before, but she realized from the surprised look on Rebecca's face that she had never even heard of the place. So Charlotte said the greenhouse is their real family pride. It's huge, and all the past duchesses have taken great care of it, pouring their souls into it. She turned toward the greenhouse and suggested that they go there as soon as possible. But as soon as they arrived, they saw the head maid at the entrance, and Charlotte said in a sad voice that apparently her mother had gotten ahead of them a little. The maid explained that Madame Adelheid was currently resting in the greenhouse and asked that no one disturb her. Charlotte smiled nervously and said that there was nothing more they could do. so she suggested they go to the place next time. But Rebecca looked at her in surprise and asked if they couldn't just have tea there with Madame. She didn't see what the problem was. Charlotte put her head down and said that she understood that her brother had told her nothing. And then she explained that there were rules in their house, which were strictly observed by absolutely all members of the family. Rebecca looked at her in surprise and asked what kind of rule that was. Then Charlotte said that she probably already knew that her mother was not quite well, but she also hates to show it the most, so she just rests alone in the greenhouse from time to time, and thus it has become a special rule for them. They never bother Mother if she is resting in the greenhouse, and she asks not to be disturbed. However they need her, they have to honor that rule. Charlotte also said that she was sure Rebecca was no exception either. The girl sighed heavily and said that she understood everything now. But Charlotte sidestepped, saying that their greenhouse is actually quite famous. They have tea parties there when the roses are in bloom, and the view from all the windows is incredible. The girl went on, telling Rebecca all about it, but she stood looking at the greenhouse. But at that moment, her little invention suddenly flew towards the greenhouse and hit the roof. Rebecca immediately ran that way, not realizing what she was even doing. After all, she had been told last night to be more responsible, and she was already in trouble. She decided never to create a magical weapon again, lest she maim anyone and break her promise. In fact, a little earlier, Carlyle had said that monsters kept attacking the northern capital, so he would have to leave for a while. However, he would try not to stay too long. The man smiled and asked Rebecca to look after the estate while he was away. She was very happy to hear this, and said that of course he could rely on her. Before long, the girl finally made it to the greenhouse and mentally apologized to Carlyle. She couldn't believe that she had really made a mess again while he was away and let him down. The moment the girl opened the doors, she immediately saw Mrs. Adelheid holding her invention. Rebecca was ready to scream, but then stepped closer into the room. Madame Adelheid was a little embarrassed, holding an object that was still smoking. Rebecca came closer and realized that she had made a mistake. She immediately turned around and apologized to Madame. She was very surprised to see Madame in such a state, and she was incredibly ashamed to have interrupted her peace. So she immediately turned and began to run away. Mother Carlyle looked at her, sighed heavily, and thought that this situation must have really shaken her up. However, there was nothing she could do. The girl had run away so quickly that she didn't even let her explain herself. The next day, the woman woke up with a severe headache. A senior maid came in to see her, asking if she was awake yet. She replied that she did, and asked for help to get her dressed. The maid immediately bowed and said she would do it. The maid approached Madame and began to remove the bandage from her head, asking her what wig she would choose for the day. Madame asked her to choose something lighter. Soon the head maid brought a wig and began smoothing it on Mistress's head.